Last time we talked about overview of the labor market, and we said that this chapter is divided into three main parts. Number one, basic definitions. Number two, how does labor market work? And finally, number four, some applications to labor market. Last time we talked about the first part in details. Today we are going to complete this chapter, and we start with how does labor market works. Demand for labor is drive the demand, which means that firms that operate in the market should interact with labor market, capital market, and the product market if they would like to survive in the market. So this means that firms are going to interact with workers through the labor market and suppliers of capital and consumers. So this means firms, in order to produce goods and services, they are going to interact with the labor market to employ workers and pay income for them or their money income back, and they have to get capital from the capital market, and they have to pay the interest for capital owners. So this is the capital market. The interaction between labor and capital and factors of production will result in the production of goods and services that will be sold to the consumers through product market. So mainly we are going to focus on the labor market or this part. So demand for labor is derived demand from the demand for the products, as consumers are going to demand for goods and services from the product market. Product market are going to supply goods and services produced by firms. So firms, in order to increase production, they have to demand more labor. So labor market, just like any market, has a demand side and supply side. So demand for labor is demand by the employers or firms, demand for labor from different labor markets. And supply of labor represents employees or workers supply their labor forces. So in the labor market, we are going to study the interaction between demand and supply in order to identify, or the expected outcome in this case will be, terms of employment, which can be represented by wages or compensation levels or working conditions, and levels of employment. Choose so just like the market for goods and services, interaction of demand and supply result in determination of the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. This is gonna be the same. Instead of equilibrium price, we have to identify the equilibrium wage, and instead of the number of units, it's gonna be level of employment or number of workers employed. So let's start with the demand side. When we talk about demand for labor, as we said, it's drive the demand from the demand for the products. So firms have to increase total production or total output and use a mix of labor and capital in order to get the final product. So output depends on amount of labor and capital, acquired at a given price level, and we are going to assume that the price of labor is wages, and with respect to capital it is rental cost, or price of capital. We can write it as W for wages, all, or rent for capital, or price of capital. The second main factor that affects firm's production or firm's output is output or product demand. What are the number of units demanded from these products? And the third factor is technology, a choice of technology available to firms. As we said, that demand for labor is derived from the demand for output. So demand of output is a function that affects the demand for labor. So we can write demand for labor as a function of demand for products is a function of its price. So demand for labor will be function of wages. Demand for labor is derived from the demand for the product. So QD, or demand for output, is the other factor that affect demand for labor. And number three is technology, as technology can be a substitute or complement for labor in the production process. So demand for labor is a function of wages, quantity demanded or quantity of output demanded, and technology. So just like the law of demand, according to law of demand, there is a negative relationship between price and the quantity demanded, ceteris paribus. So here we are going to assume that QD and T are constant. So in this case, demand for labor will be function of price. And just like any commodity, there is a negative relationship between price and the quantity demanded. So this is the same here. There is a negative relationship between wages and desired unemployment level. So this is the wage rate and desired unemployment level. Desired employment level. So if price is, wage is 3, say for example, desired level is 280, 250, 4 is 190, 5 is 160, and so on. So it can be realized that as wages increase, the desired level of employment is going to decrease. This is due to income effect and substitution effect, or scale or output effects. And substitution effect. So an increase in wage has two effects. Number one, scale or output effect. So in this case, an increase in wage result in an increase in a reduction of the scale of production, or output is going to decrease due to reduction in employment. So output will decrease as employment is going to decrease. What about the substitution effect? In case of substitution effect, as wages increase, firms are going to think about substituting capital for labor. In the production process. So employment is going to decrease as well. So an increase in wages has two different effects. Number one, output effect. In this case, production is going to decrease as employment is going to decrease. And number two, substitution effect, which means that firms are going to think about substituting capital for labor. So in this case, also employment is going to decrease. Demand for labor can be represented graphically by demand curve. So just the demand for any product, just like the demand for any product, this is number of workers instead of number of units or quantity. And this is the wage rate. So when wages is 3, number of workers is 250, 3 and 250. When it's 4, it's 190, 4 and 190, 5 and 160, 5 and 160, and so on. So this is the demand curve. It's negatively sloped due to the negative relationship between wages and the desired level of employment. So what are the factors that affect the demand for labor? As we said in the demand function, that demand for labor is affected by wages, demand for output, and technology. So technology and demand for output can affect demand for labor in addition to capital as a substitute for these products. Number one, demand for products. If there is an increase in demand for the product, even if without any change in the demand for labor, sorry, in the wage rates, so demand for labor is going to increase. And the demand curve will shift to the right. So as output increase or the demand for the product is going to increase, so producers would like to produce more and more, so they are going to demand more labor. So demand for labor is going to shift to the right. Number two, supply of capital or price of capital. Let's assume that rental payment for capital or price of capital decreased 50%. Capital and labor are substitutes for each other, or they can be complement for each other. So here we have to differentiate between two different cases. Case number one, if the scale effect dominates, more workers will be required. And the demand for labor will shift to the right. If the substitution effect dominates, so the firm is going to substitute labor for capital as capital is cheaper. So in this case, demand for labor is going to decrease. And the demand curve will shift to the right. So in other words, in the first case, labor and capital are complements to each other. So they are going to help to increase production. But in case number two, labor and capital are substitutes for each other. So in this case, firms are going to substitute capital for labor in order to save money and increase production at the same time. The demand for labor can be analyzed on three different levels. Number one, at the firm level. Number two, at industry level. And number three, at the market level. At the firm level, to analyze the demand for labor by a particular firm, we see how an increase in the wage rates affects the level of employment of specific workers, specific type of workers. Say, for example, aircraft manufacturer, so the machinists. Okay, so at the firm level, we are going to analyze a specific job and the impact of the wage rate, change in the wage rate on this job. While at industry level, to analyze the effect of an increase in wage on employment of machinists in the entire aircraft industry, we utilize an industry demand curve, which is a summation for all firms in the market. Number three, market, to see how the wage increase affect the entire labor market in all industries, not only specific industry. We use a market demand curve. So this is for a single firm. Say, for example, computer analyst, or developer, website developer, for example, in a specific firm, say Microsoft. When we are going to talk about the industry, we are going to talk about developer in developing software. When we are going to talk about the market, developer in any industry. Okay, so they don't have to work in a software industry. Software developer in any industry. Okay, this is the difference between firm, industry, and market level. Also, we have to differentiate between demand in the short run and in the long run. In the short run, employers find it difficult to substitute labor for capital. And this is true for product demand. If we are going to talk about the demand production function in the short run, you can find that there is only one variable which is variable, while all other variables are constant. Quantity of the output is a function of labor, while capital is constant in the short run. So in the short run, we cannot substitute labor for capital. So it takes time to fully adjust the consumption and production behavior. While in the long run, we can substitute labor for capital, there is no problem about that. As labor and capital, all of them are variables, and there isn't any factor which is constant. This with respect to the demand side. What about the supply side? For simplicity, we are going to assume that workers have already decided to work, but they must choose their occupation and employer. So market supply just like the supply of any products. According to law of supply, there is a positive relationship between price and the quantity supplied. This is the same here. We are going to assume that the quantity of labor supplied will be positively related to the wage rate, holding other factors constant. So if this can be represented graphical, it will be an upward sloping curve or positively sloped supply curve. This is number of workers and wage rate, for example, and this is the supply curve. What are the factors that can affect or leads to a shift of the supply curve? We have one main factor that can affect supply curve of labor in a specific position. This is, by the way, market supply curve. In case of market supply curve, in case of market supply, wage rates of other jobs will affect the supply of labor in this market. Say, for example, a change in the wage rate of insurance agents. So people would like to work in insurance agents instead of any other company. So if we study the demand for workers, supply of workers in petroleum companies, for example, and insurance wages in insurance, increase, while wages in petroleum companies is constant. So workers would like to shift their supply or their employment decision from the petroleum companies to the insurance companies. So this is one of the main factors affect supply of labor in case of market supply curve. What about the supply to firms? When we talk about supply at a firm level, we assume that supply of labor is perfectly competitive, or in other words, no firm will offer a wage that's above or below what the market wage indicates. Firms are, in this case, are wage takers. So this means that wage rate is going to be given to the firm, as each firm alone cannot affect wage rate in the market. So in this case, the supply curve will be horizontal. If the market wage rate is going to increase, so supply of labor is going to increase. If the market wage labor is going to decrease, so supply of labor with respect to the firm is going to decrease. So this is wage rates. Say for example, W naught. Let's assume that the wage rate in the market increased from W naught to W1. So in this case, in this firm, supply of labor is going to increase to S1. Next time, we are going to talk about determination of wage rate and the equilibrium in the labor market. Thank you and see you next week.